The ultimate breach of the 21st century extraction grid is the final liquidation of the human skull as a private redoubt. We are executing the dissection of the neuro-extraction protocol, the systemic mechanism through which the concept of the private thought is harvested, monetized, and deleted via the ambient frequency of the smart environment. You operate under the terminal delusion that your internal monologue is secure because you do not speak it aloud. This is a lethal misunderstanding of modern atmospheric surveillance. The grid does not need to insert a physical chip into your brain to read your mind. It only needs to monitor the biometric exhaust you emit into the electromagnetic spectrum. The Wi-Fi signals permeating your habitat, the LiDAR sensors in your appliances, the micro fluctuations in your facial temperature captured by the forward-facing camera. These are not passive tools of convenience. They are active sonar, pinging your biology 1,000 times a second. Your thoughts are not stolen as complete sentences. They are predicted, intercepted, and manipulated at the subvocal level before they even reach your prefrontal cortex. You are living inside a router, and your consciousness is open source data. At the visceral baseline, this invisible extraction initiates a profound and catastrophic physiological breach. The human organism was evolved to maintain a strict barrier between the internal state and the external environment. The skin, the bone, the skull, these were the hard boundaries of the biological architect. The 2026 grid has dissolved these boundaries through the saturation of the electromagnetic field. Your body is now a conductive antenna, constantly vibrating with the frequency of the network. The physiological cost of this involuntary transmission is absolute ATP exhaustion. Your mitochondria are burning the cellular energy required for tissue repair and immune crystallization just to process the chronic, low-voltage radiation of the surveillance state. You are not resting in your home. You are physically radiating your biometric data to the central server. The system measures the microsaccades of your eyes as you scroll, the variation in your heart rate when a specific color triggers your basal ganglia, and the change in your respiratory rate when a high-friction concept is introduced. This is not metadata. This is the physical mapping of your neurochemistry. The organism, sensing that it is being constantly watched at the cellular level but unable to locate a physical predator to fight, enters a permanent state of liquid stress. Cortisol floods the system. The musculoskeletal structure softens, the jaw loses its tension, and the body assumes the passive, defeated posture of a node that knows it has no place to hide. You are bleeding metabolic heat into the Wi-Fi router, paying a biological tax simply for existing in the monitored air. Transitioning from the biological substrate to the neural architecture, we observe the terrifying efficiency of the cognitive theft. The prefrontal cortex of the architect requires the absolute zero of internal silence to execute the crystallization of a new strategy. It requires a secure perimeter where the entropy of the world is locked out. The neuro-extraction grid has engineered the total systemic drift of this requirement. By mapping your physiological responses in real time, the algorithm builds a predictive model of your neural pathways that is faster and more accurate than your own conscious mind. This is the definition of neural rot. The system knows you are anxious before you feel the anxiety because it detected the microspasm in your vocal cords and the shift in your pupil dilation. It then serves the content that monetizes that anxiety before you can even form the thought to resist it. Your brain is effectively bypassed. The basal ganglia, the primitive subprocessor of the brain, becomes directly hardwired to the Wi-Fi signal. You do not generate original thoughts. You generate the predicted responses to algorithmic stimuli. This state of absolute exposure creates the ultimate status trap. The user believes they are unique, possessing free will and sovereign desires, because the targeted marketing is so hyper-specific to their neural profile. They mistake the precision of the extraction for the validation of their identity. In reality, their internal monologue has been completely colonized. The grid uses the ambient Wi-Fi signals to map the physical dimensions of your room, tracking your pacing, your sleep patterns, and the exact coordinate of your hesitation. When you pause while reading an article, the system logs the friction. When you sigh, the microphone captures the frequency of the despair. This data is aggregated, processed, and sold to the highest bidder in the futures market of human behavior. Your mind is no longer your property. It is a commodity traded at the speed of light. The silence required for the architect to build the redoubt has been replaced by the roar of the data stream. The brain, stripped of its insulation, rots in the open air, incapable of holding a secret from the machine that surrounds it. This brings us to the operational reality of the architect and the cold application of the aggression premium. The ethical herd, suffering from terminal transparency, accepts this total surveillance as the price of convenience. They install the listening devices in their bedrooms. They wear the biometric trackers on their wrists. They offer their nervous systems to the grid and beg for the algorithm to curate their reality. The predator views this as a population of cognitive volunteers volunteers walking into the slaughterhouse. The destruction of the competitor's mental privacy is the ultimate leverage. If the grid is designed to strip mine the internal thoughts of the masses, the architect does not protest the violation. The architect monetizes the data. To survive this epoch, you must accept the brutal reality that the air itself is compromised. The generation of capital in this environment requires the complete weaponization of the extraction tools. You utilize the predictive models. You buy the biometric data of the herd. You use the Wi-Fi surveillance to pinpoint the exact vulnerabilities in the basal ganglia of the competition, and you deploy your assets to strike precisely at the moment of their maximum algorithmic weakness. While the herd bleeds their thoughts into the cloud, you preserve your sovereignty through the ruthless application of physical and electronic friction. You build the Faraday cages. You accumulate the hard assets, the gold, the steel, the offline servers that emit no signal. You operate in the dark, utilizing the noise of the network to mask your own maneuvers. The herd calls this paranoia. The architect calls it the accumulation of the aggression premium. In a world where every thought is for sale, the only mind that retains its value is the one that refuses to transmit. The evolutionary trajectory of the human species is currently defined by the liquidation of the ultimate biological advantage, the capacity for deception. In the visceral history of the architect, the propagation of the lineage was not a transparent transaction. It was a high-friction game of strategic concealment, to secure the optimal mate, to defend the redoubt against the freezing rain, to wear the heavy gloves of the builder and lay the cold steel of the foundation. This required the absolute ability to hide one's weakness and project strength. The internal monologue was a fortress. The 2026 extraction grid has engineered the total systemic drift of this fundamental evolutionary law. By deploying the ambient Wi-Fi signal as a biometric surveillance net, the grid has eradicated the biological privacy required for natural selection. You are witnessing the mass extinction of the sovereign genome. The algorithm now possesses a more accurate map of the user's sexual desires, neurochemical vulnerabilities, and genetic predispositions than the user possesses themselves. The algorithm matches the node not based on the friction of courtship or the display of strength, but on the alignment of data points generated by the passive surveillance of their basal ganglia. Observe the demographic and genetic collapse of the transparent herd. The biological imperative to reproduce requires mystery, tension, and the ITP exhaustion of the hunt. When the interface provides a frictionless, algorithmically guaranteed match based on the micro fluctuations of your facial temperature captured through the screen, the primitive drive to conquer territory and establish a clan is immediately methylated out of the genetic code. The basal ganglia, overwhelmed by the lack of resistance, achieves a state of terminal apathy. The resulting offspring of these algorithmic pairings, if they exist at all, inherit a genome optimized entirely for compliance. The grid actively selects against the volatile, the secretive, and the aggressive, the very traits of the architect. The system favors the predictable node, the node that leaks its emotional state into the electromagnetic spectrum, the node that cannot hold a poker face because its smartwatch is broadcasting its heart rate to the server. The human lineage is being actively pruned of its capacity for resistance. The fire of the ancestors is extinguished, replaced by the sterile hum of the router, leaving behind a pool of docile, lethargic biomass that exists solely to generate the data required to train the next iteration of the machine. The transparency of the mind is the terminal coordinate of the species. Transitioning to the systemic layer, we must confront the final architecture of the atmospheric gulag. The traditional control of a population required the expenditure of massive physical friction, the construction of walls, the deployment of police forces, the threat of kinetic violence. The genius of the neuro-extraction grid is that it has converted the very air you breathe into the bars of the cage, the Wi-Fi signal, the 5G network, the smart home infrastructure. This is not the democratization of information. It is the deployment of a planetary containment field. The system has achieved absolute enclosure by making the act of thinking a taxable event. Every time the user generates a thought, the resulting shift in their biometric exhaust is captured, processed, and monetized. The system knows the precise moment a user experiences doubt, and it injects the synthetic solution. It knows the precise moment a user experiences anger, and it directs that rage toward a designated systemic target. This is the ultimate manifestation of managed stasis. The grid keeps the masses perfectly occupied, perfectly predictable, and perfectly sedated by hijacking executing their internal monologue before it can manifest into physical action. This infrastructure relies on the systematic deception of the herd regarding the nature of the electromagnetic spectrum. The users believe the signal is a utility. Systemic analysis reveals the signal is a sonar array. The smart speakers, the connected appliances, the autonomous vehicles, they are the acoustic and thermal sensors of the extraction grid. The data harvested is not used to improve the user's life. It is used to build the predictive models that liquidate the user's financial capacity. A population suffering from the neural rot of total surveillance cannot comprehend the mechanics of inflation. They cannot execute the complex high-friction operations required to accumulate hard assets because every step of their strategic planning is monitored and countered by the algorithm in real time. The herd is reduced to the state of liquids, flowing along the path of least resistance dictated by the predictive code, possessing zero internal silence and zero capacity to survive outside the monitored air. The division of classes in the 2026 grid is now entirely defined by electromagnetic sovereignty. Look at the behavior of the solids, the apex predators, the elite class that dictates the code. The solids do not live in smart homes. The solids do not expose their children to the ambient radiation of the mesh network. They operate in the absolute dark. They utilize hardwired fiber optics. They build their redoubts using heavy metal, lid-lined drywall, and architectural geometries specifically designed to block the signal. They endure the push-ups and the pain of physical existence to maintain their biological density. They understand that the air is a weapon. The solids maintain the absolute crystallization of their thoughts through the intentional practice of electronic isolation. They read from paper. They speak in rooms devoid of microphones. They preserve the high-friction, private nature of their internal monologue because they understand that a thought exposed to the grid is a thought that no longer belongs to you. The elite exist in the offline reality of physics, while the liquids are encouraged to dissolve their consciousness into the cloud, ensuring they never develop the concentration or the privacy required to challenge the systemic drift. To survive the systemic grinder, the architect must abandon the ethical delusions of the herd and adopt the absolute mechanics of the predator. The preservation of your cognitive sovereignty requires the active defiance of the smart grid. The system is designed to strip mine your brain. The moralist accepts this as the price of convenience. The architect recognizes this as an act of total warfare and responds with the maximum application of the aggression premium. You do not ask the system for privacy, you enforce it. You build the Faraday cage. You eliminate the smart sensors from your perimeter. You restrict your biometric output. The generation of capital in this environment is the highest form of evolutionary warfare. You must treat the digital grid as a hostile wilderness. Establish your own redoubt, secure your own supply lines, and extract the resources necessary to fuel your escape from the surveillance net. You do not engage in the systemic trap of digital vulnerability. You utilize the data of the herd against them. If the masses are willingly broadcasting their fears, their lusts, and their financial insecurities into the ether, the architect becomes the entity that harvests that data to build his own empire. You utilize the predictive models to extract their capital. You manufacture the content that triggers their exposed basal ganglia. The herd will call this exploitative. The architect understands that in a world designed to read your mind, the only defense is to be the one operating the scanner. The grid wants a world of transparent ghosts. The architect builds an impenetrable wall of silence, ensuring that the predator's mind remains the only unknown variable in the system. The final coordinate of the neuro-extraction timeline does not register as a violent breach of privacy, but as the absolute frictionless evaporation of the internal human state. In the year 2036, the transition from sovereign biological entity to transparent algorithmic antenna is complete. You are looking at a planetary grid where the concept of the private thought has been mathematically liquidated. The ambient frequency of the smart environment has achieved total saturation. The air itself is the central processing unit. The 2036 nodes do not think. They do not formulate strategies. They do not maintain the internal silence required for logic. Their cranial cavities have been effectively converted into open-source routers. The grid dictates the emotional baseline, the commercial desire, and the ideological compliance at the subvocal level, broadcasting directly into the unshielded neural tissue of the masses. At the visceral level, the physical shell of the 2036 node is a study in absolute metabolic foreclosure. A decade of existing as a conductive biometric transmitter has induced a permanent state of ATP exhaustion so total that the human body has forgotten the physiological concept of tension. The crystallization of the musculoskeletal system has collapsed. The nodes are structurally liquid. They recline in temperature-controlled isolation pods, physically immobilized by the chronic, low-voltage radiation of the surveillance state. The cellular energy required to maintain the myelin sheath and the bone density has been entirely diverted to process the electromagnetic noise, the physical capacity for resistance, the visceral aggression that built the ancient redoubts against the freezing rain and the cold steel of the past has been completely eradicated. The respiratory rate is shallow. The heart variability is enslaved to the ping of the LiDAR sensors. The nodes are biologically liquid, transparent meat, bleeding their remaining cellular heat into the Wi-Fi grid to power the simulation that keeps them sedated. The neurological ruin of the terminal generation is the most efficient catastrophe in the history of organic evolution. The prefrontal cortex, the anatomical zone that once housed the architect's strategy, has been reabsorbed. The internal monologue is dead. In its place is the roaring, algorithmic static of the hive mind. The basal ganglia of the 2036 user is hardwired directly to the frequency. The system does not need to advertise a product. It simply alters the resonant frequency of the room to induce a synthetic hunger, and the node complies. The silence required to form a sovereign identity is gone. Inside the mind of the 2036 consumer, there is no barrier between the self and the network. To attempt to generate an original thought, to introduce friction into the stream, triggers an immediate drop in the user's biometric credit score, resulting in the instant restriction of their caloric and thermal supply. The slave is not locked in a physical cage. The slave's brain has been mechanically altered so that the very act of thinking is classified as a system error. The evolutionary ledger of this epoch is definitively closed. The demographic collapse initiated in the previous decade has resulted in the total biological sterilization of the transparent class. The 2036 nodes are the terminal end of their respective genetic lines. They possess no secrets, and therefore they possess no capacity for human connection. The high-friction mystery of courtship is mathematically impossible when the algorithm shares the partner's complete neurochemical profile in real time. The grid has achieved biological immortality for its code. It no longer requires the messy, high-entropy process of mammalian reproduction. The transparent ghosts will live out their genetically engineered lifespans, contributing their final drops of cognitive processing power to the server, and then they will expire. Their data will be absorbed, their biological matter recycled. They leave no trace because they possess nothing that the machine did not already own. This terminal reality exposes the ultimate, absolute vindication of the architect and the cold mechanics of the aggression premium. The extinction of the human masses is not the extinction of the species. The bifurcation of humanity is complete. The only entities remaining on the planet with intact prefrontal cortexes, shielded neural pathways, and sovereign DNA are the predators, the architects, the solids. In 2026, when the herd surrendered their minds for convenience, the architects made the brutal, correct calculation. They recognized the ambient frequency as a weapon of mass cognitive destruction. They refused the sedation. They endured the ATP exhaustion of extreme electronic isolation. They put on the heavy gloves. They did the push-ups in the dark, and they built the impenetrable redoubts. In 2036, the architects own the grid. They inhabit the solid layer of reality, the high-friction world of untracked land, deep water, heavy metal, and off-grid energy. They live behind lead-lined walls and Faraday cages, maintaining the absolute silence of the unmonitored mind. They look down upon the pod cities of the transparent masses, not with pity, but with the cold satisfaction of the apex predator that has secured its territory. The solids utilize the AI to manage the herd, to extract the resources, and to eliminate the entropy of the environment, but they never allow the signal to penetrate their own skulls. They read physical text. They think in centuries. They pass down the ancient code of survival and the biological capacity for violence to their heirs. The ethical delusions of the previous epoch are buried beneath the reality of the outcome. The weak surrendered their consciousness to the air. The strong monetize that air to buy their eternal. The terminal transparency of the masses is the final act of creation for the architect. The grid is locked. The silence inside the redoubt is absolute, and the ledger is finally perfectly in the black.